So my name is Hal Varian. I'm a professor of economics, business, and information management at Cal, and I'm also an alumnus. I received my master's in mathematics and my PhD in economics from Berkeley back in 1973. I taught at MIT in Michigan for several years and then returned to Berkeley in 1995 to be the founding dean of the new School of Information. And I work in economics of information technology, which kind of explains those three appointments. I also write a monthly column for the New York Times called Economic Scene. But the reason I'm here today is when I'm not doing any of those other things, I do some consulting at Google. And I'll tell you how I came to be at Google. About 5 years ago, I stepped down as dean at the School of Information after 7 years of working at building that institution. And I thought, gee, I've been a professor all my life. Maybe it'd be fun to do something in the real world. And then the real world seemed kind of scary, so I came to Google instead. There's a lot of truth to that story, as you've no doubt discovered. But what I'm here for tonight is to tell you a little bit about Berkeley and to introduce our distinguished speakers. So we're here, meaning the Berkeley contingent, so we can reconnect with some of our alumni and friends here in the South Bay. So what's so special about the South Bay? Well, as you know, it's a great place to live, but it's also home to more than 37,000 alumni and 1,500 Cal parents. So you are a representative of this large group of Cal friends in the South Bay. Now, Berkeley, as you know, is the top-ranked public university in the world. We have the best faculty and the best students, and not just in one or two highly specialized areas. Berkeley's good across the board. If you look at the sciences, engineering, humanities, arts, social sciences, whatever it is, we're right up there in the top. And in fact, I'm told even the football team has been pretty good lately. So we're managing to cover our bases. So we retain our distinction in part due to the generous support of alumni, parents, and friends. Last year, the campus raised $347 million for more than 61,000 individuals. So tonight, we're going to hear a discussion with two of our distinguished faculty on globalization and the flow of knowledge. This is the first Discover Cal lecture to be held here in the South Bay. AnnaLee Saxenian, who's Dean of the School of Information and a professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning, and Stephen Weber, who's Director of the Institute for International Studies and a professor of political science, will be holding this discussion. Now, one of the great things about Berkeley, I think, is its interdisciplinary strength. At Berkeley, we try to nurture new fields of study that cut across several disciplines, and I think our two speakers tonight really exemplify this characteristic. So AnnaLee Saxenian has made a career of studying regional economics and the conditions under which people, ideas, and geographies combine and connect into hubs of economic activity. Her latest book, The New Argonauts, explores how and why immigrant engineers from Silicon Valley are transforming their technology entrepreneurship to emerging regions in their home countries, China and India in particular. And I think if you look around here at Google, you'll see some of the fruits of that effort. And they're launching companies far from established centers of skill and technology. And Stephen Weber is a professor of political science at UC Berkeley, where he directs the multidisciplinary campus-wide Institute of International Studies. He's also associated with the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy, the International Computer Science Institute, an affiliated faculty and energy resources group, and a senior fellow at the Annenberg Center for Communications at USC. So his areas of special interest include international politics and the political economy of knowledge-intensive industries. So Steve's most recent book, The Success of Open Source, is a study of the political economy of the open source software community. So I'm very pleased to turn the floor over to our two distinguished guests.
Thank you so much, Hal. So I want to thank Hal, who started the school that I'm now running. And I want you to just know a bit about the iSchool, the School of Information. It's the newest school on campus, but we live in the oldest building on the Berkeley campus. And we're bringing together computer scientists and social scientists and management people to understand the information economy, the information society that we are hurtling into. But I also want to add to the introduction of my friend Steve Weber, because Hal didn't actually tell you the whole story. The little known fact is that she was a med student before he went to political science graduate school. And Steve has, I would say, the shortest attention span of anybody I've ever met. He went to med school and got bored. He decided to study political science. He got a job at Berkeley doing international relations. He learned all of that, got over that, wrote a book about open source, moved on to study China, moved on to something else. Now he's off to do politics next fall, he tells me. So Steve is not only a wonderful, smart person, but very much a Renaissance man.
Well, I guess it's my turn to introduce Anna. What's your name again? I forgot. Well, I remember, I like to tell this story in front of Anna because it will make her blush. 15 years ago when I came to Berkeley, a joint friend of ours who knew Anna and knew I was going to Berkeley said, well, there's really only one person on the campus that you really actually need to get to know, and her name is Saxenian. He may have actually said AnnaLee Saxenian. And he was more or less right in that. Not in the sense that she was the only person worth getting to know, but she was the person who was most worth getting to know on the campus. Anna and I, over the years, have worked together, taught together, yelled at each other, drank together, argued about many, many different things. And I think learned a lot from each other. At least I've learned a lot from you.
Likewise.
So it's a real pleasure for both of us to be here tonight and talk a little bit about globalization and how knowledge flows. And if it's OK with you, I'll start that off.
Go for it.
OK. Globalization is a term that political scientists, economists, and others have used for a long, long time, and has recently, of course, in the last, say, 4 or 5 years, become a buzzword. And I want to say a little bit about what I think it means, what I hear from others about what they think it means, and why it's so important, and why Anna's work in the past decade has been such an important part of understanding what is this phenomenon called globalization. I've do a fair amount of traveling in the course of my research, and actually in January, February, was out in various parts of the world in a fairly short period of time. And one of the questions that I often ask folks as I move around other parts of the world, which also includes moving around the Berkeley campus in various kinds of ways. So what do you think of when you hear the word globalization? What goes through your mind? And I would say the answers I get fall roughly into 4 categories. One answer that I get is globalization is a bad thing. It is a force for oppression, for exploitation, and a source of injustice and inequality for humans. That's one sort of emotional trope. Another one you sometimes hear is, well, globalization is just a euphemism for Americanization, or at least that's what Americans think. Another one you hear is globalization is the beginning of the end of anachronistic national borders. We've lived for a long period of time in which national borders and nation states sort of defined the way politics happened in the world, and globalization is a new way of thinking about that space. This is the idea that was really, in a significant way, popularized by Tom Friedman in his book, The World is Flat. And finally, there's a 4th trope, and it's that globalization is an economic phenomenon, and it's a rising economic tide that lifts all boats. Maybe it doesn't lift all the boats equally, but it lifts all the boats. Well, step back from that a moment and get more minimalist. After all, Google is famous for being minimalist, who's done its webpage. And there's value in minimalism. What is globalization? The real meaning, I think, is a reflection on the issue of mobility, how things move, how expensive it is to move things, how quickly they move, how they move around the world. For most of human history, most of life was lived very, very close to the place where you were born and to the place where you then spent your life. And when I say life, I mean your financial life. Your money didn't move very far, and you didn't move your money very far. Your emotional life, the people that you knew were within a mile or 2 miles or even 10 miles of you. your physical life. You just didn't travel that much. In fact, it's still the case that for most people, most of their life is lived within 40 minutes to an hour of whatever the dominant mode of transportation is from where they are based. And when that was the foot, it was a couple of miles. And when it was the horse, it was a little bit more. And when it was the car, it was a little bit more. The airplane, yet more. And the internet, of course, a very different phenomenon. Now, over the course of the last 400 to 500 years, the rate at which all these things move has gradually increased to a significant degree because of technological change and because people began to think about the world differently in the context of those technological changes. That's been a very slow process. The global integration of these flows of goods, ideas, money, people has been very, very slow. And it's really only in the 20th century that we see a kind of rapid acceleration of the rate at which these things move. But interestingly, that acceleration has happened very unequally. So in the last 50 years, we've begun to move goods around the world in an extraordinarily efficient way. And it no longer really matters in a significant sense if the chair or the table is made in California or made in China. In fact, even water, right? A heavy and not terribly valuable commodity gets moved. How many of you have had the water from Finland, right? It gets moved around the world very rapidly and cheaply, goods. Money moves around the world almost instantaneously. Even before money was moving over the internet, there was the phone, and traders could get on the phone and move money around the world rather quickly. A very different world from, say, the bearer bonds of the 17 and 1800s. We actually had to carry bonds across the ocean on an ocean liner. And now, of course, in the last decade, 15 years, 20 years, the rapid, rapid acceleration of that process with regard particularly to knowledge. And the company we're sitting in today wouldn't exist without that mobility of ideas. But we've also learned one other very important thing, which Anna, I think, understood in her early work about the ways in which clusters of industries form and sort of help each other evolve, and even more profoundly in her latest book, that the ideas that really matter are not the ones today. Technology may change this, but today, are not the ideas that can be digitized. They're not things that can be coded into bits and bytes and sent across fiber optic cables. They are ultimately the ideas that fall into the vessels that we think of as human minds. And Amsterdam understood this in the 17th century. The people in Amsterdam understood that the only way to really generate above-trend economic growth was to have people with knowledge and ideas come to live where they were, in Amsterdam. In fact, in a funny way, as digitizable information moves around cheaply, easily, and is available to everyone all the time for the same price, the ideas that people have in their heads and carry with them in a tacit way, the knowledge and the things they know about how to organize, how to be creative, how to be innovative, how to relate to other human beings, become, in some sense, the only thing that really matters relative to everything else that you can sort of buy as a commodity. But if you think again about globalization as mobility and flows, people, goods, ideas, information, money, people have always been the least mobile of those factors of production. Partly that's because people don't like to move. Right? They're culturally, emotionally, family, and in other ways linked to where they started. Partly because national governments don't like it when people move across borders most of the time. But that's where the real transfers of knowledge, the ones that are most interesting and most important, are happening. Now, Anna understood that sooner than anyone else and wrote a really, really interesting book about people, brain power, ideas, and movement. So I'm going to turn it over to her to tell you a little bit about what she knows.
Wow. Thanks, Steve. Well, I think just to pick up from where Steve left off, the world has been global for a long time. And in fact, there's a big debate among academics. Is this globalization bigger than the one that occurred at the end of the 18th century, at the turn of the, at the end of the 19th century, 18th century, turn of the
19th century,
1800s. Yes, yes. Because that was a massive globalization that ended very abruptly with the start of World War I and a series of protectionist tariffs that really closed the world economy off and closed activity back into national economies for many decades, really until very recently. So the debate has always been, is this globalization that we're living in today really that different? And I would argue that the one thing that is really different now is the mobility of people and the ability of people to move much more quickly and to, in fact, live in multiple places and do business in multiple places at the same time. Of course, the internet has made it easier to trade. Global trade has increased because there's a new technology of transportation. It's cheaper now to send things on an airplane than it was before. Obviously, capital flows are even accelerated through the use of the internet. But that's an acceleration of a similar trajectory, along a similar trajectory. The thing that I think is really qualitatively changed now is this movement of people. And it's not all people. The story that I'm going to tell and that my book really tells is about an elite. It's about an elite that's actually extremely influential and, I would argue, transforming the patterns of development in the world economy in a way that we've never recognized. And let me just sort of step back and tell this story from the perspective of Silicon Valley, of where we're sitting now. I had been a student of Silicon Valley for many years. I had, in the early 90s, wrote a book comparing Silicon Valley to the East Coast area, the Boston's Route 128 area, MIT, Harvard, which most people would have predicted would be the center of high tech in the US economy in the post-war period. It had Digital Equipment Corporation and Wang and Prime and all these very successful big companies. And it was close to the Washington, where you could get defense contracts. It had a longer industrial history. There were all sorts of advantages that the East Coast had over this little West Coast region that was really the center of apricots and the biggest exporter of prunes in the world. Yeah, in the 1940s and 50s. And the thing that I observed was that there was something about this tabula rasa, the greenfield environment of Silicon Valley, that allowed for a very different organization of people in production. People were, instead of organizing into big vertically integrated corporations where everybody was organized hierarchically and really related only to the community within inside their corporate boundaries, Silicon Valley created a much more open environment where people moved between firms quite regularly, sometimes alarmingly, and where ideas were allowed to recombine quite quickly and lubricated with venture capital, allowed people to experiment much more freely with new ideas, with new technologies, and it created an environment that is much more dynamic technologically, much more adaptive, and really just left some of those older mini computer makers in the dust because they weren't able to keep up with the pace of technological change and the pace of market change. One of the things that I observed in the, actually it was pointed out to me after my book came out by a venture capitalist. I got a letter from someone I had never met before, and he said to me, you know, I thought your book was right on target. You got it exactly right, but you missed one thing. You missed the immigrants. And the minute that I read it, I knew he was right. Because as I had been doing my work throughout the 80s and early 90s, I had met a growing number of entrepreneurs from India, from Taiwan, from Israel, from China, and I hadn't really put it into my framework. So I set out, and this was great. This was just before I had my second child, and I wanted a small project that wouldn't require too much travel. And so I said, all right, I'll just study how many immigrants there are in Silicon Valley. Well, it turned out, and this was the late 90s, there were far more than anybody had recognized. They were often not so visible because they were working within companies. They weren't really at senior management positions yet, or even at middle management positions yet. And the most interesting part of the story I learned after interviewing many of them was that they were building these very powerful links back to their home countries. It wasn't just that they had been absorbed into Silicon Valley, but that the Taiwanese were going back and forth to Hsinchu Science Park. The Israelis were setting up firms back in Israel. And suddenly I realized that I had to travel again because this was a really fundamentally transformative process. Why is it so transformative? You know, I think back on my grandparents. They migrated. They migrated from Armenia. They came here, but they lived their whole lives in Lowell, Massachusetts. They never even went back to visit. That's the case of most migrations. There, of course, have been migrations that transferred technology. The British industrial technology for manufacturing textiles was transferred from the UK. Germans transferred the technology for the chemical industry. So it's not that technology hasn't been transferred by people before. But the interesting thing today is that people could not just go one way, but people could actually go back and forth and even commute. People can now live in Silicon Valley and have a home in Taipei or in Shanghai and actually run a company based in the two places and live between the two. They can stay in touch by IMing or emailing. They can communicate by email. That makes it a fundamentally different world. As an economics student, as an undergraduate, I learned about the brain drain. And I was told that the brain drain reinforced the asymmetries of the global economy, that the rich would get richer and the poor got poorer because essentially you were attracting the best and the brightest from poor economies like China and India into the US, and they were staying. And it was right. I mean, that analysis was right. In fact, there were economists who proposed taxes on these people because we were stealing the brain power. And a funny thing has happened in the last 20 years. As these people start to go back to their home countries with increasing frequency, start to set up businesses, start to create new markets in their home countries, start to work with policymakers in their home countries, they are seeding new centers of technology, new centers of sort of entrepreneurial experimentation in distant regions. They're not necessarily investing in competing centers, but they are investing in centers of capability, in clusters, if you will, which over time are gaining in skill and capability. When you put these people together in a place, they learn by doing. So you're seeing a process, a very dynamic process in these places, and places like Tel Aviv, like Taiwan's Hsinchu region, like Bangalore, like Shanghai. And very quickly, Silicon Valley is no longer the sole dominant center of technology that it was. When I started to study this place, there was no competitor. People would always say, well, how about Boston or Austin or Seattle? And I would say, no, 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 no. And it's true that Silicon Valley remains a distinctive place, and I'm happy to talk about that at some point. But we can no longer assume that innovation will only come from here. In fact, we can't assume that it will just come from the US and Western Europe anymore. Innovation is now flowing from many parts of the world. It is a much more complicated, exciting environment, and actually I would argue that we are sort of we've opened the door to a process of global wealth generation that is potentially the most expansive that has ever been seen in human history. The thing that we can do now is that these networks of Indians or Chinese, these diaspora networks, they're becoming search networks. And they're very effectively scanning the environment they know the best, and identifying pockets of skill, of technology, resources. And suddenly, you see Google setting up a branch in Krakow, Poland. Mm-hmm. Who would know that there is an institute there called the AGH University of Science and Technology that is turning out brilliant scientists, mathematicians, and scientists. From the US, we couldn't have known that. But, the Indians that came here from the IITs and studied in Silicon Valley, studied in the US actually anywhere, and got sucked into Silicon Valley in the last 3 decades, they knew where to look back in India. They knew that, for example, southern India was the place where most of the military defense establishments, most of the government research establishments had been set up. The best engineering colleges in India are all in the south. They understood how to go back to India and tap that set of skills that had otherwise been very underutilized. There were a lot of underemployed Indian engineers for a long time who are suddenly now part of the global economy and contributing very actively and actually developing now in India a set of skills in the service economy, sort of how to develop a service, a customized service product, a large-scale one, much more efficiently than we do it here. So suddenly you see centers of skill developing in these distant places. They're linked to Silicon Valley. This is not, in fact, it's not the kind of competition we saw with Japan in the 80s. And I would argue that we're actually benefiting tremendously from those capabilities. We are now able to have any of the electronic devices that you have with you today were undoubtedly manufactured in China. Probably the firms were from Taiwan, and probably those Taiwanese firms had research offices in Silicon Valley. So the architecture maybe was defined here in the US, the design, but then it was, logistics were developed in Taiwan and in China. So we're now sort of leveraging the capabilities of a much wider population. I think unless some radical change happens in the global economy of the sort that we saw in the teens of the 20th century, you're going to continue to see more openings, more places where skill exists that can be integrated into the global economy and recombined in a very, I think, a very beneficial way, not only for us, but also for these other economies. I won't go on too much longer on this track without letting Steve jump in and ask some questions. But I will say that I'm painting a pretty rosy picture at the moment, a picture of the way that Silicon Valley is spawning new centers of technology, and that there's a mutual benefit as people move back and forth and actually help development in those places. The people that go back help advise policymakers on how to develop their educational institutions. They advise them on how to organize their capital markets. They're often an influence in terms of increasing transparency, creating corporations that are more egalitarian, that, you know, they're often going into environments that were run by family-owned firms or state-owned enterprises and creating a kind of governance structure that we would find more familiar. So I think they're contributing in many, many ways to development in their countries. The downside to this, and I think anybody who lives in this world knows this, is that it's also creating a very uneven landscape. And so this is where I think Steve and I depart from Tom Friedman. The world is not yet flat. I wish it were. But you're seeing places, for example, in India or China that are better connected to Silicon Valley, perhaps, than they are to the rural areas in their home countries. And this can be a source of great political unrest. It will require, I think, policy attention. And so I think the dark side to this cloud is that even though we're spreading wealth and know-how and technical capability back to parts of the world that have never known such growth in the past, and that's a beneficial thing for the world. We're opening up new markets in China and India and Latin America. We're also contributing to a very uneven pattern of growth, and I think if not attended to, can be a source of great unrest. Why don't I pass this back to you and let you spin some ideas for us.
Anna Saxenian is at heart an economist. You don't mind me saying that, do you?
Well, I'll get back at you.
In a positive sense. Anna thinks, and wonderfully and profoundly, about systems of value creation, which is what economists do very, very well. I'm a political scientist, so I think about value destruction. And so, layered on top of what I think is Anna's story, which I think is profound and true, in that order, are at least 3 issues, challenges, problems that need to be solved, managed, met. And I think they're all recognizable. Well, actually, there's also the inequality one, but I think in some sense that's a function of some other challenges, which I want to just sort of raise for discussion. One is our own sense, as well as the sense of others in the world, of whether transitions from places or conditions where factors and things that we use and need are immobile to mobile, the movement into flows is a good thing or a bad thing. Human beings are powerfully ambivalent about this, and always have been. Right? When money moves around the world, some people are very happy, but some are just not sure if it's a good. Is it a good thing? And I'll again turn to the Japanese example. Remember how we felt sort of uncertain when the Japanese in the 1980s decided that they were going to buy Pebble Beach, and MGM Studios, was it, and Rockefeller Center. We had a huge debate over whether that was a good thing for the American economy or a bad thing for American economy. Right? Our former chairman of our Federal Reserve and our current chairman of our Federal Reserve are not equally certain or agreed on whether or not the U.S. current account deficit, which is simply a symbol of the fact that others send us more goods than we send to them, indicates a weakness of the American economy or a strength of the American economy. Right? Right. When ideas move around the world, right, we like very much the notion of American cultural exports. Sometimes my friends in Washington call it soft power, right? Moving from Hollywood to Bollywood. But we're not so sure we like the ideas moving back in the other direction. Right? And we're very ambivalent about the fact that going on Google, I can access an extraordinary amount of the world's information, but also so can jihadi terrorists get to their favorite websites. So there's always an ambivalence about this. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I think when people are involved, when we're talking about flows of people, the ambivalence gets ratcheted up to a new level. We're talking about human beings moving from places where they used to live to where they now live, carrying with them things that we don't know, in their heads, ideas, right? We love some of that stuff, and some of it we feel very ambivalent about. And we're going to have to deal with that ambivalence. Ambivalence never goes away. It's just something you deal with. But we need to deal with it in the political process. Second, there is a concern, I think, and an issue that relates to the question of inequality. And I would call it the growth of the global super-empowered individual class. Anna referred to them. I wish. Anna referred to them as the elites. A group at Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, which wrote a very interesting story about this, refers to them as business class, by which they mean not that they are in the business world, but that these are the people who sit in the business class section of transnational flights. And in fact, when you get bumped up to business class, which happens more and more as I travel more and more, which should happen all the time, you start to see the same people, right? And guess what? They know each other. And they live in almost like an overlay network of the world in which the rest of us tend to, the world in which, so this argument has been made for a long time domestically, I'm sure you all recognize, about education systems in the United States. When wealthy people pull their children out of the public education system, they can create a kind of private network where everything is better, but the standards in the public education system start to fall. And of course, those people who are influential, wealthy, and otherwise no longer have a real interest in that infrastructure that the rest of the world has to use. This class that has been empowered by this set of changes is increasingly, in more and more aspects of its life, separating from the rest of the world. So, yes, today you see them in the business and first class sections of airplanes, but actually increasingly they have their own jets, so they don't even fly out of the same airports that we do, right? Their children go to different schools, but increasingly they don't even go to schools that are open to anybody else, right? They have different healthcare systems than we do, concierge doctors and so on and so on. So the empowerment of this class is not simply a slightly greater bump in inequality. It's creating a new set of both possibilities and problems, challenges that need to be met. Not necessarily a good thing or bad thing, just problems that need to get thought about, talked about. And finally, and I think this should resonate particularly in this building, in a positive sense. As economists, we had a set of ideas about how we would attach value to factors of production, right? Steel, design even, tables, right? Water, and other such things. What we're talking about now, as people carrying tacit ideas, which by their very nature don't get traded in markets and don't have explicit prices attached to them, is a real hole in a theory of, like, how much is that stuff worth, right? When the entrepreneur who has been trained at UC Berkeley, at Stanford, or elsewhere, but happens to be Indian, Israeli, Taiwanese, goes back and brings with him or her that set of knowledge, training, so on and so forth, how much is that worth? How do we value that piece of intellectual property, which actually isn't intellectual property? It's intellectual something. But it's not exactly property because It's not clear who owns it. It's not clear what the price of it is. Not clear how you would trade it. In some sense, that's what makes it so valuable, but we don't know how to assess that value. And so we fight over that. Countries fight over it when they argue about the protection of intellectual property rights. The university fights over it internally when we try to decide, well, is this person's intellectual contribution greater than this person's intellectual contribution? I think companies fight over it internally when they try to decide, for example, and this is something I've thought a great deal about in an open source software environment where code is not priced. Well, how do we know how much to invest in which project, where the value is being created? I mean, Google has solved that in various kinds of ways. I mean, one of the kind of innovations for which this company is famous is the idea that we're going to give all of our employees, right, 20% of their time to work on stuff which we can't value, which we don't know how to price, which we are not sure but we suspect that there's something value out there that we'll eventually be able to understand. Right? There are few parts of the world economy that create as much surplus as Google does that would allow 20% of its population or 100% of its population to spend 20% of its time in a non-monetized creative space like that. And yet, look at what we're able to accomplish when we do that. Again, a challenge, not necessarily a problem, a roadblock, something that needs to get faced.
Well, a minor challenge. So essentially what Steve has done, I think, right now is laid out, I guess I would say, 3 arguments about the politics of this massive wealth creation that we're seeing right now. And in fact, I think the politics are the hardest part. As usual, creating the wealth is not the hard part. The economics actually is pretty straightforward, and the politics are really the nasty part. And if I can summarize what you said, I think that the first point that you made was sort of the ambivalence about the US and the world economy. Robert Reich wrote an article about a decade ago, who is us? You know, if Toyota is manufacturing cars and employing hundreds of thousands of US employees, are they now a US company? Or are they a Japanese company? Should we like them? Should we hate them? You know, how do we deal with that? Should we get mad at Google when it sets up this plant in Poland? Are they stealing jobs from Americans? Or are they contributing to the value creation that then redounds back to us? These are deeply ambivalent issues. The second issue that you raised was, what I heard you say was this global elite, this business class. This is actually very funny. The first time I went to Taiwan, after I'd started studying these immigrants, I thought, I've got to go to Taiwan. Something's happening in Taiwan. And I went and I found a Taiwanese student, and he helped me set up a bunch of interviews in the Hsinchu Science Park with people that had actually worked here, gone to school in the US, worked in Silicon Valley for a while, and then gone back and set up startups, actually very successful companies in Taiwan that often were cross-regional companies in the sense that they had activities both here and there. They weren't, so it's very hard to tell, are they Taiwanese, are they US? And I went and I walked into one CEO's office, and he looked at me and he said, you know, you didn't have to come all the way here. You could have just gone to the Red Carpet Club at San Francisco Airport. Yeah. And of course, he was right. I mean, these people are always on airplanes, and you can meet them in business class. So there's something to this global elite class that are living in airplanes. And, you know, one of my graduate school advisors, Manuel Castells, used to call it the distinction between the space of places and the space of flows, which sometimes I think you're starting to sound like. I'm
starting to sound like Manuel. It's time for me to get my short attention span to get out.
Move on. But it really is, I mean, the metaphor, the space of places, is that there are some people that are connected to the schools and to what's going on in their local communities, to the infrastructure, to the things that matter to our kids and our future. I mean, we think about this in Silicon Valley all the time. Are we only supporting ourselves and our families? What about the Latinos in, you know, East Palo Alto, or what was East Palo Alto and now is, you know, some part of San Jose? Those are real issues for us, and those are different than the one. It looks like these people that live in airplanes may be less attentive to those. I'm going to come back to that. And then the final one that you pointed out was our ambivalence about immigration. And I think anybody who reads the newspaper these days knows that we're very confused about what should we say about immigration? I'm making a case that immigrants are not only that when they come here and start companies, which they do in large numbers, that they're creating wealth and jobs that benefit all of us, but also that even when they go home, they're continuing to contribute to a kind of global wealth that will eventually be beneficial to us. That's a hard thing to get your head around if you're a laid-off software engineer, you know, from a defense contractor, and you may never find a job again. I mean, you may just, you know, so these are very, very important issues. And I think, I certainly do hope that we can come to terms with the immigration issue, because I think it could ultimately be a very damaging, if we take a very conservative position. Already since 9/11, we've actually clamped down on the flow of immigrants into the US, at least skilled immigrants. You know, we have difficulty now with getting good graduate students into Berkeley because they don't get visas. Inviting lecturers to come is much harder. So already that flow of really talented people to the US is, you know, being constrained, and there's a potential for that to be constrained more. So I'm going to be a naive Pollyanna and say that we should be, rather than closing down the doors, in spite of our fears of those networks, and there are fears of those terrorist networks, that the right policy is to stay open, and that ultimately we will have to just deal in individual cases with those problems. As for this global business elite, the astronauts, I guess I would point out that these are the people that are actually transforming their home countries. So it's not just that the Taiwanese, or let's say the Chinese, are going home and starting companies and getting themselves rich, but they're also reforming their home economies in ways that are very beneficial for everybody in those countries, and hopefully for the rest of us. They're going back and they're talking to policymakers. They're the ones that went to Beijing University or National Taiwan University, the IIT, so they can go home and talk to the policymakers in Beijing or Delhi and say to them, you know, you've got to really invest in education, or you've got to really think about how you structure these corruption, you know, whether you clamp down on corruption or not. And they're really helping do the kind of, I would call, institutional reform that promotes development, that supports development, that hasn't happened. You know, we've been trying to throw money, the World Bank, IMF, those guys have been trying to throw money at development, at developing economies ever since World War II. And we haven't been very successful. I think, you know, we throw lots of money into aid packages and to big dams and big projects, and the result has not been very good. But I think when you actually have local people going back and working with their colleagues to help reform their domestic institutions, you see a kind of progress that Americans could never have made from the outside. I mean, we're always going to be outsiders. And so people who speak the same language and understand the institutions can actually make a difference. And I think we're seeing that already in India and China, and I hope that we will see it in Latin America and even in Africa as time goes on, in other parts of Asia. I said I'm Armenian. I'm a third generation Armenian. My grandparents left around 1915, and one of the things I wish for now is a greater flow of Armenians back home to reform those institutions. They're very corrupt. They're very political, and I can't go back and say anything to them. But if there were some really smart engineers who went back and could get the ears of the policymakers, they might be able to make a difference. So I agree that there's a threat from this space of flows, but let's look at the flip side. And then finally, ambivalence about who is us. Wow. You know, one of the interesting trends is that India just recently decided to have dual citizenship. So people can now be citizens of India and the US. I think that's a kind of opening up that we need to encourage. I think that the openness to promote the exchange is only good. And I think that in the absence of signs of risk or threat, the openness works to our advantage. There will always be these worries. The Chinese are stealing our technology. Mm-hmm. They're going to take us over. Often, I think those are said in moments of anxiety, mm-hmm. especially moments, the US in moments of economic anxiety can become very xenophobic. I mean, we've seen it in the past, and I think in the current moment, there are a lot of those trends. I was recently the co-author of a study that found that 25% of technology startups in the US were started by foreign-born engineers, you know, immigrants. And I got a lot of compliments, but I got a lot of very angry people writing back to me and saying, you know, they're stealing our jobs. I think the evidence would suggest that that isn't the case so far, and we haven't seen it. You know, we were freaked out about the Japanese in the 1980s. We were very worked up about it. Everybody went and studied Japanese, first of all. And then everybody got very worked up about the Japanese taking over. Well, in fact, that's kind of fizzled out and looks a little bit silly. It is possible. Now, China is a much bigger economy. It will become a very powerful economy at some point, maybe not in my lifetime. But I suspect that there's also that mentality of panic has set in a bit even now with us and China. China has a long way to go, and there are many challenges that stand between China and superpowerdom. And I guess I'll just say one more thing and then hand it back to Steve. You mentioned the issue about how people take their know-how with them. People take tacit knowledge with them. And it's like, well, can't we control it? Like, you know. It's the same problem that happened within Silicon Valley over the past several decades. Somebody leaves Google and decides to go start their own company. Google says, you're stealing our something. Well, it is possible that they're stealing trade secrets, but also what they're taking with them is just the know-how that they've developed by being a human being working in a place for a number of years. And there's no rule for policy in stopping that. This is your human capital. This is something that you've developed. And there's no reason that the state or anybody else should stop people from taking their know-how and their experience and their creativity and moving it somewhere else. And so the parallel goes for going home. It may be a net loss, but the US doesn't own the know-how of the individuals that live here. If people want to go home and contribute to development in their home countries, I think we have to just like Google has to say to the guy that goes and starts his own company. If he's not stealing specific technology, if he's only taking human know-how, which resides within it's their experience. It's like what they learn in school and what they've learned over the past 20 years. That's great. Go for it.
I'll just make two very quick observations, and I think we should turn it over to the group for a little question and answer and discussion. As you can see, for better or worse, Anna and I agree on 95% of this. One observation is just kind of a phrase, and it's people often say in the internet economy, anyone can be anywhere. It's still the case that everybody has to be somewhere. And people feel that very deeply. We need to take that seriously and acknowledge and honor that and turn it into the kind of message about global value creation and the extraordinary amount of new knowledge, new ideas, creativity, innovation that is available. There's a huge pie out there. And if we spend the vast majority of our energy figuring out how to slice up today's pie instead of understanding the unbelievable amount of energy, creativity, innovation, and human ingenuity that we can tap and bring together and create for ourselves as a globe, we will have done a great disservice to ourselves, not only to the other human beings who live on the planet. Part of what I see, our role is, and I never really thought about it exactly this way, but as educators in a college campus, is to make sure that as the kids and the graduate students that we work with move from being, teenagers to being adults, from being in the educational system to entering the working world and becoming both active economic players and active political players in the world, that they understand this potential. Yeah. And because the concepts are not always intuitive. Yeah. They are not. It is not always intuitive to imagine that when a piece of knowledge goes across a border, or goes across a company border, that actually creates new things for everybody and potentially more wealth that can be shared more broadly, which benefits all. That's not an intuitive concept. Part of what we try to do is bring that out to people, help them understand the conditions under which that can be true, what they can do to contribute and live in that world, and how to explain to each other and sort of acknowledge and honor the fact that it feels a little weird. Yeah. But leaning into that weirdness, understanding that it's in some sense, an anachronistic, old way of thinking that we have to leave behind in order to solve the problems that face us on a global scale. On a global scale. Is part of what we think, the University of California really want to be about.
Absolutely. And before we open it up, I think Steve is right. I mean, I think helping people, students, young people, to understand that it's not a zero-sum game.
Yes.
That really the world economy, there is not a limit on human creativity, on the opportunities to solve political problems, to create value, to grow. We have an energy crisis. We have a lot of smart people in California, in the US, in the world. If we can help them, provide them with education, provide them with the resources and an institutional framework where instead of being terrified or threatened, they are empowered, we can actually create the kind of society globally that we would like to see. And I think now we've talked a lot.
Yes, that's
there's a microphone right here, and I believe that Shirley back there also has a microphone. So if people have questions.
Hi, thank you. Dean Saxenian, you made a comment about the engineering elite in India being disconnected from many of the rural poor in India. And it seems to me that we have the same problem in the United States, that people who live and work in high-tech areas such as Silicon Valley are in effect disconnected from Nebraska and Mississippi and Kentucky and other such places. And also with the people who represent those places in the government who don't really understand what it is that we do.
Absolutely right.
So the question for both of you, I guess, is do you think that this is going to become a more severe problem in this country with the attendant political problems?
I'll say a quick word. I mean, I live in Oakland. I don't think many people in Silicon Valley know much about what's going on in Oakland. Just
right,
to bring it even closer to home.
Right, or the Central Valley for that matter.
The Central Valley, yeah. So I think it is absolutely, it's a problem both here and there. And I think one of the things that I see that's positive in India is that actually some of these engineers are contributing back in ways, very important philanthropic ways to their home countries in a way that I don't actually see among my peers as much. I think because we live in a generally wealthier society, we don't have the immediate demands. But I do think, and I think Steve will probably be able to say this more elegantly, but I'm going to just start it, which is this really is a political problem, and it's a problem about figuring out how to explain and create a political platform that can speak to both the people in Oakland and address their needs. One of the important needs is the need of sort of economic insecurity. Health care, Social Security reform. Those are things that if we don't address, people will continue to be reactive and protectionist and all the things that we're kind of arguing against. So it's a problem of political ideas and leadership that we are a long way from addressing right now.
Yeah. No, I think this is a profound question, both nationally and globally. And that's why I worry about that disconnect of concern. I do think there are opportunities, let me put on my political consulting hat for a moment, and say I think there are opportunities for creative politicians to focus on issues that actually rebind those groups together. And I don't necessarily think fear of an unknown enemy is the only one that is out there. Right? I mean, in some sense, why is Al Gore so popular right now? Because he's identified an issue that binds those groups together. Yeah. Maybe not in terms of what the solution ought to be, but it binds them together in terms they can agree this is something that we both need to worry about. There aren't an infinite number of such issues, but we know what they are. We know what they are.
Education, healthcare.
Right. We know what they are. And I think that in some sense, if I had to sort of make a prediction now about whether the presidential campaign that we're seeing unfold as we speak, we look back after November of 2008, was it a constructive, useful campaign that helped America as a society to debate important issues about which we have to make hard choices, or was it a destructive, vindictive campaign that made us feel really lousy about ourselves and each other? That will depend on whether or not the leading candidates actually embrace those issues, the ones that can bind those people together instead of just saying they're going to do it. Yeah. So demand it, and maybe we'll get it.
I have a question about the culture that is being lost by globalization when you travel now. And just as an example, we were in Costa Rica, in San Jose, Costa Rica, or I should say San Jose. And, and the shopping center in there, if I had closed my eyes, I would have said I was in Westfield Mall. Yeah. And there's no more the mercado, there's no more, you know, the different stalls and things. And I asked somebody if they, a native of Costa Rica, and she said, you know, we had to go with it because the kids wanted it. They saw, you know, in the internet that what people were wearing, and they wanted Nikes, and they wanted this and that. And so I'm wondering what's going to happen to the uniqueness of each culture and country, and if that's just going to water down to something that's Anytown, USA.
Yes, I have a comment on this, which is may sound a little bit overly optimistic, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Oh, good. You're going to say it instead of me.
Cultures change. That is just, I take that as a kind of a tautology. And Fiddler on the Roof tells you about why that's so hard. It's gut-wrenching. And homogenization has always been the fear of cultural change, that people would become more like each other in profound and important ways, rather than in, say, surface ways, like everybody wants to wear Levi's blue jeans. Now, some of that happens. But even sort of, you know, as I was walking around this building, which I've not been in this particular building before, we recognized, in a sense, here's an architecture which is profoundly homogenizing. It's called cubicle culture, right? And in fact, has been the butt of an enormous number of jokes. But what do we actually see when we empower people with just a little bit of freedom? We see the energy of human beings to endlessly differentiate themselves from each other. Right? As they become more alike in some ways, they find new ways to establish and address and express their individuality. We've seen it on the internet. We see it in physical spaces. We see it on the Berkeley campus all the time. Right?
Come to Berkeley someday.
And you know, let me be clear. It's a different kind of difference than we had in the past. But it's still a difference. And you know, human beings will create that difference because that's just who we are.
I'll say one more word. I mean, I've had that experience. I mean, I remember I would forget where I was with my family, and my husband just looked at me and said, "This is like Disneyland." It's the same shopping center. It is the same shopping center everywhere you go. What's also true is if you can get off the beaten track, it's actually not. I mean, there's still a tremendous amount of local culture all over the world. But you can't go to the places that I go to with my family. You have to actually sort of take the risk of stepping outside of the mainstream hotels and going to see these other environments. And I think a part of the reason that Berkeley is so unique is we get students who come from all over the world, who come not from only the big cities where the tourists travel, but the countryside. And they come and they mix it up. And you really do see these amazing recombinations and sort of new things emerging. So I'm also optimistic, although God, I understand that experience. Oof.
Just have a quick question on gender. Have you seen any trends in terms of an equal playing field, and particularly interested in the immigrants going back to their home countries? Yeah. What's happening in terms of opportunities for both?
So the issue, the gender issue, is a really interesting one because it doesn't, the elite in these countries tends to still be the male elite. So the people that even come here in the first place are overwhelmingly male, as you would see in a US engineering community. That said, some of the entrepreneurs that I've met, Indian and Chinese born entrepreneurs that I've met, are some of the most dynamic people that I've ever met. The women. The women. I mean, the women, and I guess I'm especially struck by the women from India, and I don't quite know why that is. There's some story, but there's some very powerful women who have gone back to India and have really built a bridge. There's a woman named Radha Basu who set up HP's office in Bangalore in 1985 before anything was there, and she fought just battle after battle after battle to set up the infrastructure. And she's a real pioneer in that community, and there are others that I could cite today too. So, but they're still small numbers. I mean, it's a continuing battle to get women engaged in that part of the economy. That's another story.
I want to make an upside argument on this, as long as I'm being the optimist for the moment. It's always, when I started studying national economies and comparing political economies among different countries, I went to Japan in the late 80s when Japan was powerful and growing. And the first thing that I took away from that experience was this profound disbelief that a country that had essentially chosen, for all sorts of different reasons, to disempower 50% of its population could be as successful as that country was. And that as soon as they figured out that they were only accessing 50% of the humanity that had lived on that island, it was going to be a very different world. Now, what Anna, I think, is part of the story that she tells so powerfully is the enabling of little bits and pockets of people in these entrepreneur networks that exist in societies from which they were previously disenabled or unenabled or just weren't, in many ways, more amazing.
They're more.
Well, harder to understand, certainly, but more amazing. If we figure out how to empower them, well, then we've really got something. It has to transfer in that way.
Thank you for walking all the way up to the front to give me the mic before I trip into the aisle. No. I loved your analysis of what's happening in Asia. I mean, both of you, from a political and an economic standpoint. I mean, you I think, gave due diligence to the potential political problems that come when you've got uneven income, and particularly when that income divide starts growing. What I'd love to get you to talk about, from both a political and an economic perspective, are parts of the world as opposed to kind of the dynamic within countries. I mean, the continent of Africa, for instance, Bangladesh as opposed to Bangalore, places that one could argue have been left out. And if you've done, looking at Anna for a second, analyses to look at basically what created those fertile environments in India, in China probably more profoundly because it's a totalitarian state, but that allowed this amazing transformation that's happening and will continue to happen, to grow. And obviously there's huge parts of the world, you know, and a huge continent really that's been left out. And the brain drain, from what I've seen in Africa, is only one way.
One way.
No,
it's a really important question. So the first thing to say is that one of the things that the internet exposes, and then these search networks sort of identify, I guess, is that the world is really actually heterogeneous in some ways. And so one of the things that these people are doing is identifying these pockets of capability, and even Africa has pockets of capability. There are places that are really doing interesting things in South Africa, in parts of Africa that you would never know, but we would never know, right? We sit in the US, how could we know? So the thing about the growth that we're seeing now is that local people are going home and taking those pockets and then helping them continue along that trajectory. The thing that is the most profound in terms of the cases that I've explored, the number one thing is education. These are the places that educated at least some portion of their youth, and it's not their whole youth. Both in India and China, it's a small elite. But they gave them sufficient education that they could come to the US. Once they came to the US, they got integrated into an economy where they built the know-how, the contacts, the networks that allowed them to then go back and integrate at least parts of their economy back into the global economy. The education system, and Taiwan and Israel are obvious examples where they invested over decades. This is not a quick process, but over decades in educating at least some portion of their youth sufficiently. Africa does educate some, but
you need like a critical mass.
Well,
in some places you do have an educated elite in sub-Saharan Africa, again, South Africa, but that brain flow being kind of, just one way, where that educated elite, because there isn't enough of a critical mass, flows one direction, and it's to Europe or it's North America.
I mean, Steve's going to say something about this. I will just say that 20 years ago, you would have said that about India. You would have said, it's just not enough people. It's a brain drain. The Indians won't go home. Indians that I talked to 10 years ago said, I would never go home. It's too corrupt. It's too bureaucratic. So these things can change very quickly. And I'll let Steve sort of pick up on.
Yeah, well, I'm going to do something that, as a student and fan of the open source movement, I think I've never done before, which is I'm going to channel Bill Gates. Yeah. This is a profoundly disturbing moment for me. Bill Gates made a very important point about this, actually, in his role as global philanthropist, about which there are some issues, but in any case. I agree with Anna. I mean, in a world where human capital is the primary driver of value creation, education is the thing that makes that possible. It's the raw material. But what Bill Gates said, which was actually, I think, very important, others have said it too, but he said it in a very profound way, which was that, you can't educate children who are orphans of AIDS if they, don't have a home to go to. You can't educate children that are hungry. You can't educate children that suffer from malaria. There are some very basic needs on the African continent that we have, frankly, just, the colloquial phrase would be punted, but for the most part ignored because we saw it as not significant to us. Okay? Interestingly, and I think this is part of what is so, in a sense, powerful about the kind of work that Anna does. For years and years, people who have tried to counter that view and said, we need to get engaged with the African continent in a serious way, have made that argument from the perspective of countering a threat. The threat of disease, the threat of war, the threat of terrorism, the threat of whatever. And you know what? It's never really worked. Fear has never really driven that engagement. The story that Anna was telling is, well, maybe we shouldn't be trying to drive that engagement politically through a story about, maybe we ought to be driving it through a story about opportunity. And, that might actually be a much more powerful magnet. We don't know, but I think we might just find out over the next decade.
And I guess I would just, because I'm so interested, I guess I would say that the challenge historically has been that we've sort of brought foreign institutions in to help out. I think you have to understand that it's going to be local people and local institutions that are going to actually be able to make the changes. And so if you want to help as an outsider, you need to really be working with, because the problems in Africa, they're disease, but it's because they have a set of institutions that aren't actually helping to address those problems. And there's often wealth in those countries. It's not that there's not enough resource. It's that it's being, siphoned, diverted. So, the role that a diaspora, an elite that's been in the West and has some commitment to going back, which, I actually believe that people that grow up in one country and then move abroad ultimately feel some commitment back home. That if there's, it doesn't have to be a lot of them, but if they can go back and try to engage, that they're going to be the ones that are going to help make a difference. And of course, the philanthropists can help chip in, but ultimately institutional change has to come from at home.
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah, really. We should learn that lesson, too.
Thank you very much for your talk. I've really enjoyed your perspectives. I have been involved in international things for about 30 years, starting with going to Japan in 1973. I have the feeling that globalization is unfolding along the lines of how Americans see the world. We're leading it. And I think in my lifetime, there's going to be other people leading globalization. Yep. And I am very curious to see how Americans are going to adapt to that. What that means is the center of power shifts, and other people are going to call the shots in globalization. And a specific example would be Americans are generally, my own personal opinion, Americans are generally very open. And being from California, we're sort of the most open. Yeah. And we've been very familiar with different cultures and allowed many people to come. Silicon Valley is so representative of that. I remember once I heard a second or third generation Chinese person on a radio talk show say, "Oh, the discrimination I have felt here." And I thought, good grief, if I went to China and tried to open a business, do you have any idea what kind of discrimination? Because in Japan, it was like that.
Yeah.
It was never, never, never
Right.
open to foreigners to come and open and start a business. And then I lived through Japan, going through that phase of Japan, the sort of occupied nation, going through that very high and mighty period through the 80s and also the decline. And let me tell you, it was made very clear that globalization looked a lot different to them. It was not the American model at all.
Right.
And luckily, I stayed through to see the Japanese react to the Chinese, who then had their own networks of Chinese entrepreneurs that were only open to Chinese people and probably only open to the Fujian people of southern China in certain places. So I'm just very curious what you think might be, or anybody else's thought of what some other models of globalization might be.
I have a couple of quick comments on that, which are more reflective on what I think the trend in that process that you've laid out, or how it's emerging, and I think it's absolutely right. At one level, that the conversation about, well, who gets to write the rules? And how open are they? And when I say rules, I don't simply mean rules of business and corporation, but the rules in terms of what can you say to someone when you walk down the street? What can you put on a website? Can you take out of your library, or what are your rights to privacy, and so on and so forth? That conversation takes place at two levels. Among politicians and business people, it takes place in the space of technology standards, reserve currencies, things like, is it the dollar or is it the euro, or will it be the renminbi in 15? Who gets to write the technical standards? Does Intel actually control the standard for Wi-Fi encryption, or is it going to be a Chinese standard called WAPI, and so on? And that's a very important debate in which political power and economic heft really, really matter. There's another conversation going on at the same time, which is in some ways a little less accessible to us, but I think in the long run, much more important. And that's the conversation that is going on among the 18 to 25-year-olds who see all that stuff as completely irrelevant, and who are merging their notions of identity in much more interesting ways than our generation, frankly, ever will. This, I think, is a really powerful and healthy trend. It happens in physical space. I was in, we were talking about this, I was in a hotel in Korea on a Saturday night in Seoul a couple of months ago, and the hotel bar was filled with Japanese 20-somethings. Japanese kids coming over from Tokyo to spend the weekend in Seoul because it was the hip and cool place to be. The Japanese and the Koreans
don't like each other.
At the political level, we would think, this is not possible. But you know what? For those kids, it didn't matter. Right? Second sort of virtual example. And we see this in the generation of kids that we teach. I have people that I only really know from online interactions. And I have people that I know through physical interactions, and also, so Saxenian and I, we have lunch together, right? There are people that I am closely tied to in many ways who live in other parts who I've never met, but I know that, for me, there is a distinct difference between those two relationships. I couldn't tell you exactly what it is, but they exist in very different categories for me. For the 20-year-old undergraduates that we teach, no distinction.
Yeah.
These are my friends. The fact that my friend exists in virtual space and I've never met this person, irrelevant. I mean, really not relevant.
But actually, it's not the virtual versus the real distinction. It's the cultural distinction.
But I mean, the thing that amazes me, and I think that we're all going to be blown away by this generation, because they aren't quite at Berkeley yet. They aren't quite in school yet. But they're going to come in, they already have. I mean, I have a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old, and they have skills that I can never imagine having in terms of just being able to deal with technology fearlessly and easily. They're talking, my kid sits there with his headphones and talks to people in Bulgaria and in Latin America, and it's just sort of, he's playing these games with them all around the world. He does not see national boundaries at all. It's just not part of his worldview. I don't know what that will mean in terms of
But they're speaking in English to each other.
Yes, they are.
But on the cultural, I mean, this is actually very interesting. I think, I'm not a cultural anthropologist or whatever, but let me put this out there as a hypothesis. Cultural boundaries are something that are learned, not ingrained in the human brain. I grew up first in New York City and then in a kind of suburban community outside New York, where I don't think until I was 18, I met someone who was neither white nor Jewish. And by that point, I knew there was a difference. I mean, I knew there was a difference between us, okay? But if I'm embedded in these discourses of different, even if they're taking place in English, from the time I'm old enough to speak, I don't think that those cultural walls become things to break down. I think they're just not there in the same way. I don't know that that's absolutely true, but I think we're going to find out. I think we're going to find out.
Are you ready to learn Chinese?
My kids are.
Oh, so
Both
hard.
of my kids want to learn Chinese.
So hard.
And my 14-year-old wants to go study in China for a year. I could never have dreamed of that as a 14-year-old. It wouldn't have crossed my mind.
No.
I never got in an airplane until I was 18. I mean, it's just a different world. I lived in Hong Kong for 2 years and called my parents twice. And one was because my aunt died. The world is so much smaller now. It's hard for us to really imagine more people.
Couple of questions. 15, 20 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about economic clusters. And if I were to simplify it crudely, it required that several elements symbiotically built sort of the best of breed, politically, research, marketing prowess, production prowess, all work together to create a virtuous cycle, excuse me. Is there a sign now with globalization that certain regions can lose one or more of those corners and still do quite well? So is that cluster breaking down in a sense? You can lose an element. Second question, you suggested that you're going off to Washington, Steve. Who's going to gain from the benefit of your political brilliance and creativity?
The Mets. The Yankees? The Mets, or the Yankees. Let me make one comment about, and I'll turn, because Anna is the absolute, you've got the best person in the world to ask that question to about clusters here, so I'll answer it first, and then I'll let her tell you what's really right.
He's too nice.
Okay, I think there's a piece of the cluster that is getting peeled off. I don't believe that other people believe this, but I think it's true.
Which piece?
And I think it's called finance. I think the discussion that's going on now around the let me call it the mania almost about the notion that American capital markets have become uncompetitive relative to those in London and Hong Kong as a result of Sarbanes-Oxley, which thus needs to be thrown out because maybe it went over the top in terms of regulation, is a kind of a peculiar attachment to the idea that in order to have a world-beating, world-class economy, one needs to have a financial market based in New York. I have a feeling this is the last gasp of that conversation. Certain kinds of financial expertise are critical parts of clusters, and we see it here. I mean, here in the Valley all the time. But the notion that financial markets, which in some sense are the most globalized element of the modern economy, currencies are instantly convertible. There really is only one language. They're just different dialects. And things move instantly. I mean, faster than anything else, right? Because it's just, you don't sell a stock. You press a button. I mean, has anyone here ever seen a stock certificate? Actually, dumb question. Yeah, I mean, I've never seen a stock certificate. I would know what it looked like if I saw one. It's a bit on a hard drive. I'm curious to see how this argument plays out, because I don't think the United States, I don't think it matters to us where capital gets raised.
Oh boy, do I disagree.
I knew you would. That's why. Now let's hear from the president who actually understands this.
Well, no. I mean, look, capital is more mobile than it's ever been. Capital is not the constraint. So in the manufacturing economy, there was a constraint. It was capital and labor. Now the constraint is skill. I mean, if you want to grow, you have to have skill, and capital will probably follow. That said, clusters, and by clusters what I mean is subnational concentrations of activity, or maybe not some, I mean, Taiwan I would consider sort of a cluster of its own, or, you know, but they have a kind of finance that is embedded and has local knowledge. And that kind of finance, what we call venture capital here, is still very distinctive. And part of the reason is that national capital markets are not global yet. So if you go to China and you want to invest in a startup, how are you going to take it public? How are you going to actually realize your money? If you're a venture capitalist who knows a good investment in China, you know, the dollar isn't converted, or it's not convertible to the RMB. How do you exit? There's no exit option yet, okay? The stock market in China is completely politically controlled.
That's true.
The party decides who gets listed and who doesn't. It's not. So the belief that American capital markets exist everywhere is still not true, and that India is not. I mean, there are not capital markets of the sort that we have and London has, that are open and fluid and can transform, you know, that you can actually generate wealth and then cash out. Clusters, I think, have become more important in the global economy. The story that I tell is about clusters that are connecting and deepening their capabilities, so that Taiwan and Silicon Valley are very deeply connected. Each of them has different skills and capabilities. There are things that they can do in Taiwan that we don't do here now. They can design a motherboard quicker and better. They can manufacture chips in their foundries better than all but very few US companies can do. I think you're seeing the kind of concentration of skill and capability in Bangalore that will be unparalleled in time. And so what I see is that, and this is back to Steve's comment, was it about Amsterdam? Or think Florence. It's when you get people together and you have opportunities for them to be creative together, is that you create clusters. And because know-how is so much more important to the global economy now, it's when you get smart people together who can learn and experiment with one another. This is sort of the fundamental notion about a cluster, is that you get people who have smart ideas and really have resources at their command. That's where the value will be created. Of course, you can send a branch plant off anywhere you want, and that won't look like a cluster. But the really valuable ideas, I believe, are still coming out of clusters.
And I would just add, I think that's absolutely right. I'll add to it that the single most important physical thing in a building like this, I think, is the whiteboard. Because it allows people to stand together in front of it and talk.
Yeah.
The single biggest competitive advantage for an organization that depends on brain power, and this I feel very strongly about, is the ability for that group of people who are standing in front of the whiteboard to be greater than the sum of their parts.
Exactly.
And for all of us who have worked in environments with, you know, reasonably smart people who tend to be a little eccentric, maybe a little egotistical, kind of difficult sometimes, moody, bordering on, you know, autistic and schizophrenic.
He's talking about my colleagues.
I'm talking about Anna's colleagues, not mine, of course. Getting a team to work together, and that's the mini version, you know, the physical, tangible mini version of getting that team to be greater than the sum of the parts is what everything is about.
Yeah, that's the
and it is really, 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 really hard, and it takes an enormous amount of investment of time, energy, and frankly, human trust. And I don't think you're ever going to get that except when people are physically together. And, you know, in some sense, look, I mean, people love to make fun of Google. You got the, you know, the shuffle boards and the pool tables. But look, why is that there? It's there because it enables, in some important and unmeasurable but clear sense, the teamwork that actually I still think Americans are better at the end of the day, than any other culture on this planet. That, in the end of the day, is what's going to make us strong, not the fact that we have the best capital markets.
Yeah, good point.
Huh? I told you, the Mets.
A quick question here. Well, I'd like to think it's a quick question, but environmental stability, is that compatible with globalization?
That's Steve's area.
There's no such thing as environmental stability. The environment has never been stable. It always changes.
Sustainability.
Yeah, sustainability. There's no such thing as sustainability. If we were to really have a sustainable economy, in terms of not running down over time our stock of natural resources, if that's how you define sustainable, never been such an economy on this planet. Never, even in the caveman days. Survival, now we're talking. Okay.
Got to be precise, you know.
I'm sorry.
He's picky about words.
Yeah, you know, I don't know. But I can tell you this. I don't think it's fundamentally a question of whether or not we can develop technologies. I think it's fundamentally a question of whether or not we have the guts to face the problem. And I get beat up a lot in Berkeley for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. What I fear, I mean, look, along with many others, I am, let me say, heartened by the fact that over the last couple of years, the political and social salience of concerns about global climate change have gone from something that the scientists and a few economists and a couple of eccentrics in Berkeley cared about to a discourse that is now really quite broadly spread within the American society and even globally. I think that's a great thing. What I'm worried about is a sense of complacency that it couldn't go away tomorrow. And I'm skeptical. Maybe because I spend too much time around politics, but I'm a little skeptical. Here's my concern, and this is what I think is the most important thing that needs to be dealt with to answer your question effectively. What if the next 2 or 3 years do not see a city in the United States destroyed by a hurricane and the floodplains of Bangladesh flooded and 1 million people killed, and creeping desertification of the Sahara and glaciers? But let's say the weather, and notice I say weather, not climate, because they're very different, that the weather stabilizes over the next couple of years. My concern is that the saliency of the issue of climate change would start to sort of step down the radar screen in a way that would be profoundly, profoundly troubling. We got to keep, I mean, this is excuse me, I did not intend to bad job. Got to keep the heat turned up on this issue. Because I'm afraid that the issue here, and it really is the answer to your question, I'll end with this, is not can we get the technology, not do we have the resources, not do we have the smarts, but can we keep our attention on this issue over the time frame that it's going to take to solve it. Now, according to Anna, I am not the right person to be making that argument. But I think that is really the answer. The question is, can we attend to it long enough to actually invest in a way that solves the problem?
Some parts of the world are embracing globalization. Other parts are rejecting it, turning their back on it. Some parts of the United States are rejecting globalization. I don't want any part of this. A lot of that's tied in with religion. Most parts of the world, religion is becoming less popular, less of a factor. In the United States, it's gaining in importance, gaining in clout. How do you tie in religion with globalization or lack of?
Okay.
That's a touchy one.
Probably the hardest, and when I talk about this, you'll notice that even when I started, I said these are the emotional reactions that I hear people having to this phenomenon. I mean, economists like to stay out of the realm of emotion, but I think you've touched on something very, very profound, which is that human beings react to economic change not only in terms of how it affects their pocketbooks, but how it affects their hearts, spirits, guts, whatever you want to call it. Religion is one particular, and in some cases, particularly volatile expression of that emotional reaction, or at least that's part of how I see it. From a statistical kind of data standpoint, the United States is really the outlier on this. I mean, every other, I think this is right to say this, that every other large industrial, post-industrial wealthy economy has gotten less religious as it evolved, gained wealth, and so on and so forth, the United States being a significant exception. I think it's up to us, because in some ways, we were a society that was founded on the notion of religious tolerance, right? A group of people who left what they thought of as belief in tolerant societies in old Europe to come to the New World in order to have the freedom to practice their religion and to allow others to have that freedom as well, right? And the principle of separation of church and state and so on and so forth, on which this country was significantly founded, was an attempt to save the church from the state, not the other way around. It was an attempt to enable religious freedom by taking the state out of the equation. We have a lot to teach the world about that, as long as we can remember that ourselves and make sure that we instantiate it on our own behavior. If we don't, I don't think anybody else is going to be able to solve that problem better than we did. So we better do it. I think we're done. But now we have the fun.
Yes, I think we need. Okay, we are actually raffling off an iPod. I hope you all got your cards in here. I forgot to put mine in.
One person.
Steve gets to pick.
Oh, I get to pick. All right, so I'll show you.
Shut your eyes. Don't pick. You.
And the
winner is
remarkable Saxenian.
Thank you.
It's David Leland. David Leland.
He left already. No,
come get your iPod.
From Google. This is donated by Google. I want to also take a moment to thank Google for hosting us in this lovely setting.